Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stacey Kengesser. I am the fundraising director at the National Trust. I will tell you just a little bit about what to expect today and why we're hosting this event. So you will hear from some brilliant leaders about their approaches to nature positive practices, how they put people and nature at their decision making, and how they work with others and across the sector to deliver. And that's exactly what we're about at the National Trust. So the National Trust is one of the UK's largest charities. We are also one of the UK's largest landowners. And for 130 years, we've been looking after the nation's special places for everyone to enjoy. And that includes, get my numbers right, but 250,000 hectares of land and nature, over 800 miles of coastline, that's 1,800 farms, 500 historic houses, 220 gardens, and 11 World Heritage Sites. And we rely on the support of individuals, and we have almost 6 million members and donors as part of our community, but also the support of businesses to make that work happen. And we do that for the benefit of everyone everywhere. We have recently launched a very ambitious new strategy. It's called People and Nature Thriving, and it has 3 big outcomes. So we will work in partnership with others to restore nature on our land, but also beyond our land, because nature doesn't care about boundaries, and they get in the way. The second big outcome is to end unequal access to nature, beauty, and history. And we will be working with others to create more nature-rich and heritage-rich places closer to where people live. And the third outcome is to inspire millions to care and take action. But for today, please just enjoy the panel. Thank you for coming. There's more information available on the QR code if you click through, and you'll also see many of us with our lanyards walking around afterwards. We'd love to chat to you and hear more and lots of different ways to get involved. So for now, thank you. Thank you to our panelists, and over to Paul.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Paul van Sale. I'm one of the co-founders of the Conduit, and I'm always delighted and thrilled to help facilitate anything that the National Trust does. It usually is about 30 seconds notice and I say yes, which indicates my affection for the institution. So I'm going to start by doing a sort of declaratory statement. You should presume that this panel knows their oats and are very expert in the subject matter. So I'm going to start by asking each of them just to give a 20-second bio as to who they are and why they're interested in this subject matter, just to credentialize them as if that were necessary, but just to situate them. So I'm going to start with Julie.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Morad. I am part of Salesforce's global sustainability team, and I'm probably the least of the nature experts up here. I grew up in California, so have a fond appreciation for nature and redwoods, and I feel like that's part of my core. But as a professional, I started working on our nature team 3 years ago when we were in the midst of developing our nature strategy, which I'm excited to talk a little bit more about today. But it's been a very crazy learning journey, but I feel very welcomed by many of the folks in this room and the wider nature community.
Thank you. Aidan?
Morning, everybody. My name is Aidan Lonergan, and I work for Natural England, the government's advisor on the environment. I've been living in the UK. I'm originally from Ireland, a place called Tipperary, which I'm sure you've all heard of. I've been working in this sector over 30 years. I've gone through the nature conservation stage and now in the nature recovery stage, and I'm really interested in how businesses can play their role in funding, financing, creating the space for nature recovery, working with a sector that's been calling out for this extra support for a long time. And I'm really glad the National Trust invited us here today. Thank you.
Lucinda?
Hi, yes, Lucinda Langton. I head up sustainability and packaging at M&S Food. And I think my team and I sort of steward our Plan A. I say steward because it's been in existence for the last nearly 20 years. We're known as an ESG leader, and a key part of that is supporting British farming in particular, and also the nature strategies that come as part of that. So yeah, looking forward to contributing.
Thank you. Carl.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Carl Moxley. I'm the Group Climate Director at Legal & General. In a nutshell, I'm responsible for setting our group-wide organisation's climate and nature strategy, the risk management associated with climate change, and our execution of transition plan. So my background, actually, I might be one of the least expert in this room. So my previous two roles, I was the Chief Financial Officer of our largest pensions business. The role before that, I was the Chief Risk Officer. My background isn't in climate and nature, but I have a huge passion for nature in particular. And the reason those last two roles I wanted to articulate is part of the rationale for me coming into this role was to start to consider how we accelerate as an organisation more the commerciality of climate and nature, which I feel is going to be key to accelerating some of the huge amount of nature restoration and protection that's needed across the globe.
So let's kick off. I just came from a breakfast with some very large asset holders and pension fund managers, and I started the breakfast by asking them, so tell us, who are in sustainability positions, tell us where you think there's opportunity and where there are bright spots at a time when ESG is under assault and there's been a backlash and it's not as fashionable as it used to be. And to a person, they all said, well, nature is having its moment. And I thought, well, how convenient that we're about to have this panel. That really tees it off. And so I guess there's sort of something in the zeitgeist that nature is everybody's business, that it's being recognized as an asset class, that people are beginning to see that it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And so, Aidan, I'd like to kick off with you and just ask, firstly, why do you think that is? And two, what role can the business community in particular, but in partnership with NGOs, civil society, communities, government play in sort of taking this rather fuzzy notion of nature as an asset class and giving it meaning and substance and giving it the centrality that it deserves?
Thank you, Paul. Nature's having its moment. Well, I've been waiting 40 years for that, so I'm glad I'm still working in the sector when it's arrived. At Natural England, we believe that it's essentially the operating system for the economy, for the health, for our future. You can't have a thriving economy without a thriving system underpinning it, and that system is our environment and nature. Our strategy, I was reading the the National Trust strategy last night on the train coming down, and I think, restoring nature, tick, we're the same in Natural England. Ending unequal access to nature, tick, the same. Inspiring millions, I'll leave that to National Trust and businesses to get involved because we're not that kind of organisation. But it's certainly reflected in our strategy, which is in development at the moment, which is recovering nature for the growth, health and security of this country. And so nature is essential for everything, we would say, and it's not something that we would kind of, we still want to debate. It's just there. The evidence is there. If we invest in it, which we're now doing, if we degrade it, which we have been doing, I should say, we expose ourselves obviously to greater climate risks, poorer health, higher costs, and declining productivity. But if we decide to invest in it collectively, that's business, government, NGOs, etc., you unlock multiple benefits: clean water, fertile soils, carbon storage, healthier people, and resilient supply chains. It's good for business, it's good for people, it's good for communities. We think it should be embedded in how businesses plan, invest and report on their activities. Partnerships are crucial here because the sector has been thriving away, or not thriving, but trying really hard to conserve nature for the last 40, 50 years, certainly since the 1949 Act. And collectively, we haven't been successful. So we need government, business, and the third sector to work together. So partnerships are absolutely essential to getting this on the right track. And I'd leave it there, Paul, for the moment.
So I'd like to now kind of move down the panel and ask you each for some specific examples. So the National Trust is trying to restore 250,000 hectares of nature-rich land by 2035. And each of you in different ways through your organizations or your businesses are trying to think in practical terms what a nature positive practice looks like, or a business strategy. So Lucinda, MCS's Farming with Nature program is bringing regenerative agriculture into your supply chain. And can you tell us a little bit about what impact you're seeing from that?
Sure. So we've actually just finished the first phase of our Farming with Nature program, and I think it's been incredibly successful. I mean, I can give you stats. I think one of the learnings has been we have a lot of overview metrics, if you like. We know that X number of farmers, 400 farmers have participated. We know that they're all doing leaf mark standard plus our M&S modules around using less pesticides, so IPM, and nature recovery. We know that there's been some fantastic stats on individual farms, but the aggregate of that is, we can say that, I think I'm going to look at Helen now, 15,000 hectares of land has been, if you like, preserved for nature across that farming estate, which is brilliant. So we know there's that sort of thing, but the actual impact measurement is much more hard to go after. So we can sort of give you the overview metrics, but the actual impact, and I think that's the next phase of our program, will be about doing that. So I guess our program had three elements. The first bit was about brilliant leading edge nature focused standards, so Leaf Mark Plus, as I said. So big partnership with Leaf as part of this program. And then the second piece was around then going out on the ground and helping farmers really understand how to implement some IPM measures, and we had a series of grower groups across the country. I think we stepped in where the government funding sort of declined in that area, and we've had some really great engagement from growers and farmers across the country. And then thirdly, a lot of focus on innovation. So how can we work with companies like LandApp and AgriSound to really understand how we can measure and monitor things like pollinators and habitat on a much broader swathe. So again, moving now into that sort of, what does the impact metric look like, and the outcome metrics, rather than just the overview metrics. Does that help?
That's very, very, very helpful. So I think one of the things that we're going to try and explore today is that businesses are wildly divergent in their business models and what they're trying to do. So if a firm that focuses on regenerative agriculture as part of its supply chain, which is essential, is going to have a completely different set of challenges to a tech company. And you are nevertheless trying to kind of integrate nature positive strategies across your supply chain and how you work. So how does Salesforce even start with thinking about this? Because in some ways you could just exist in the cloud and it would all be completely irrelevant to you. So why do you care?
One might think that. Well, maybe I can start with the genesis of our work on nature. And really, Salesforce, we'd had a handful of investments into nature over the past decade or so, predominantly in our nature-based solutions as part of our carbon credit portfolio. But then 5 years ago, we recognized the real important role that forests will play in carbon sequestration. So as a result of that, we spearheaded the Trillion Tree Initiative with 1T.org and the World Economic Forum to bring a community and really create an ability to have greater partnerships between governments, NGOs, and companies, and get companies really excited to contribute to this movement. So we set our own commitment to fund the growth, conservation, and restoration of 100 million trees, and that was kind of our nature program. There are other pieces that I'm going to gloss over for right now, but we realized there was more to it than that, right? Tech companies are not immune to having our own nature impacts. And so we went through a process to define a more holistic strategy. And where we landed was a 3-pillar strategy that focuses on reducing our own nature impacts, which are predominantly around water, leading on restoration at scale, continuing to lean into those commitments that we had already made and doubling down on them, and then also leaning into the opportunities, which is accelerating our customers who have high impacts on nature and are in need of management systems, like Lucinda was saying, to bring together all of the different pieces that we're measuring and monitoring so that they can actually be enabled to act. But if I lean in on the restoration pillar, just to kind of give an example, given the relevance to the work that the National Trust has been doing, we're over 50% of the way towards our commitment. We've worked with 25 different partners around the world in 23 different countries. It's a really phenomenal program. It's much more than just a number of trees, right? We're looking to invest in projects that have an impact at landscape scale. And part of the way in which we do that is working with other companies that are part of the 1T.org alliance, right? We need to establish those partnerships, share best practices, share what's working, more importantly, share what's not working, right? How do we bring additional transparency to this movement so that companies can have confidence, but also be really realistic of what they're able to accomplish on the ground? And that's been really important to us. So as I think about our value chain, right, we're thinking about how do we engage our customers with that pillar on accelerating our customers. We're thinking about our upstream impacts as we look at our nature impacts, and I'm happy to share more about our process for that evaluation and what we're then doing about it. But then continuing to lead on this restoration piece is really important, and we're now at a moment in time where our impacts are really related to water, as I said. So where can that restoration work benefit the watersheds in which we're operating, strengthen resilience there, which ultimately will strengthen our own business's resilience?
So part of what we're talking about today is the role that business can play, but we're also all recognize that government has a massive enabling role. And we've seen just this week, the government announced the largest, you're talking about water, the largest investment in flood defenses in the history of the UK, and that's obvious and understandable. But you also make a business case about dealing with water practices and flood mitigation, not just in avoided harm, but also in how you can use it to build that infrastructure. So, Aidan, just tell us a little bit from where you sit at the kind of nexus of business and policy and governance. What do you think government could be doing or is doing to support and subsidize this area, to make it easier for businesses to do the right thing?
I think the role of, when we say government funding, it's our money. The role of public funding in this has to be used very judiciously. And in the sense we want to start things, help pilot things, get things off the ground, start to give confidence to emerging markets, those kind of things, and hopefully play a part in supporting the development of a system where the natural flows of capital will pick up the heavy lifting, if you like, on nature recovery. Examples of where we're currently working with businesses, and you'll probably have heard about these in the press, but with water companies, we're working on nutrient mitigation schemes just to do habitat restoration and management, which will unlock development. So that's good for business. BNG, biodiversity net gain, is now a legal requirement on all development in this country. And we're rolling out now the highest tier of the new environmental land management schemes, which are working at a bigger scale than ever before. I think we've got 22 of them in the pilot phase, covering over 50,000 hectares. So the role of government and government funding is to not crowd out private investment, but to create the conditions where things can be started. They can give some element of managing the risk at the start of things and use that to catapult greater private investment into these things and further down the line.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Carl, in some ways, financial services insurer, you just would have seen Norges released a report a week ago saying that across its entire portfolio, its baseline for physical climate risk went from 2 to 4% to 19 to 26%. So this is a fund, 1.6 trillion of assets under management, more than 1% of all the world stock markets, saying that between 20 and 25% of all assets that it's invested in have some exposure to physical climate risk. So it's pretty self-evident why you would care from an insurance point of view about nature and climate risk. But that's sort of on the negative side of the ledger. There's also the kind of the positive side of the ledger, what one would invest in and what one would be doing proactively. Tell us a little bit about your thinking on both scores.
Brilliant. So before I do that, I think it might be helpful just to articulate who L&G are. I know most people probably have heard of them, but what we actually do seems to have a wide range of views. So we are the UK's largest asset manager. We have over £1 trillion of other people's money that we manage on their behalf. And we're also a leading life and pensions insurer. Okay, so to be clear, we have no general insurance business and so on, but we have about 100 billion of our own assets that we invest for ourselves and to meet our pensions promises. And we've been around since 1836, so a huge kind of longevity and stewardship and that long term is in our DNA. And why is that important in the context of this? It's important because one, Our ethos is to create long-term value for our shareholders and our customers and our clients. We've already heard from the panel, this is financially material. There are an awful lot of stats and views out there about, in the next however many years, how much GDP might be impacted, including in the UK. In the next 5 to 10 years, it's predicted in the UK, certainly by others, that if we do nothing and continue on this path, the GDP impacts are likely to be worse than we saw during COVID. So just to put that in context, I mean, it's a huge amount, and it's estimated about half the world's GDP is in somehow linked to nature. So it's systemic, it's a massive issue, it's hugely financially material, and therefore we should all care about it. And from a legal and general perspective, that's what we're doing. So if I think about how we make a difference, and how we've linked it to our strategy, we've articulated our certainly climate strategy and now nature, because we've integrated nature into it, into 3 simple pillars. The first one is invest. So how are we investing on behalf of others and on behalf of ourselves to make a difference? And what does that mean for nature? And I can very happy to cover what that means for us and why it creates value, and some of the points Aidan's made around creation of that environment for us to be able to invest whole scale and materially in this. How we view our own operations. So clearly we have occupied offices. We're also a home builder in a variety of ways. So we need to think about that legacy. We need to think about our water usage, our recycling, everything you do with our supply chain and as running a business, and also how we engage others. So we are a huge shareholder with those trillion of assets that we manage on people's behalf. You can imagine the power of our stewardship and the power of what we're able to do. That's also integral in how we engage with both companies from a nature and climate perspective, as well as wider. So you talked about the government, our engagement with them and other organisations to move towards the future that we want. So I can go into any of those specifics, but that's really how we're viewing it. And I think the key point I want to land on this element in particular is, for us, it's been articulating this and integrating this as part of the business strategy, not just the right thing to do, which is a fantastic win and an easy sell. It's actually how do we drive long-term value from this, and how do we make our own balance sheet resilient to the risks you've just talked about. I mean, from our perspective, we estimate around half of our assets are linked to nature somehow. Right, so it's more than the 20%, and clearly physical risk is a huge part of that. And where we have properties, which we have a lot of, how we think about the flood risk, and clearly that's linked as well.
I'm going to take you up on the invitation to be specific. So I'd love to hear, tell us about a program or a series of investments or a set of initiatives you're taking, which sort of make this tangible for people, because you're going to do this in a hard-nosed financial way because you must. It's your fiduciary responsibility. So give us an example of a project that you're doing that you think illustrates this.
Fantastic. I'll give you 2. I'll do 2 for the price of 1. So I'll try not to get technical, but one of the things we've invested, I would say around £400 million in now, are something called debt for nature swaps. Okay, so debt for nature swaps are a financial instrument where some countries effectively swap some of their debt payments to other nations in return for lower debt payments, and some of the amount that's saved goes directly into nature conservation, and that is material. Okay, so we've done that in, I think, Belize, Ecuador and Gabon. We are cornerstone investors in some of them. That is a growing market. There is now a few billion, I think, in that market, where you're actually seeing tangible nature restoration. And one of the most important things in all of this is how verifiable it is. We may or may not know around the carbon markets, and they're voluntary. There are clearly challenges of how do you actually prove that some other projects that others are investing in actually sequester carbon and you get those benefits. The debt for nature swaps are highly regulated, which gives millions and millions into ocean and rainforest and other type conservation. So that drives value and nature conservation at the same time, and it drives value because as you say, I'll use your expression, but the hard-nosed financial element is the investment yields, that the risk return is attractive compared to other things we can make, which is the thing that's going to move the dial here. And then my second example is a slightly smaller one, but something close to my heart. I embarked on an initiative last year where we own land around the UK, nowhere near as much as the National Trust and things you've heard, but little pockets here and there. One of the pieces of land which we couldn't build on for a variety of reasons, I managed to get the business case to stack up that we were going to forest and rewild it. And we were going to do that and keep the carbon credits ourselves to help offset some of our future emissions, because reputationally, we know it's going to happen. We have someone doing it, and biodiversity credits as well to sell to local landowners to make that work. So we know that that's driving value, and that from itself is a less cost in the future because it's our project. But there's lots of little examples like that which are starting to grow. And from my perspective, because I've now gone into the numbers, I believe I can scale, which then makes it an attractive potential future asset to back our pensions liabilities.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. That made it very tangible. So I want to ask a slightly different question around the kind of nature agenda, and that is a sort of critique of it, which is that nature is a plaything for the wealthy, that it's a luxury, and that people who live either in cities or are marginal and poor are kind of afterthoughts. We care more about beavers than we care about people. And a brief moment of reflection. I'm South African. South Africa established some of the most remarkable national parks ever under apartheid, and did so by excluding people who owned that land and caring more about elephants than about black South Africans. And so there can be a stain on this unless we think about inclusion and diversity in thoughtful ways. And so, Lucinda, I'd love to ask you a little bit about the work that you've done. I think it's Open Farm Sundays, thinking about work which is sought to think about equity and diversity and trying to make it relevant to people who are often sort of forgotten in this regard.
I'm not sure I think others may have more to say on this than me, but I would say yes, one of the things that we have done at M&S is be a strong partner of Open Farm Sunday. We think it's really important that people know where their food is grown and how it's grown and what goes into growing food. So this year we went out to A.H. Worth, which are one of our potato growers in Lincolnshire, and I think we had 1,500 people come through the farm that day, seeing different bits, and our stand talks about pollination, the importance of pollination. We made a lot of seed bombs with children. So yeah, great work to people who don't usually get opportunity to go on farm, and I think that's just a great example of that. But I'm not sure that is probably from an M&S perspective what we do in that area. I think others may have better examples or different examples.
Great. Well, Aidan, you're natural England, but you also do things in urban settings, and you think about this a little more. Tell us about it.
So we certainly do. I mean, the reality here is 80% of England's population lives in urban areas. Nature conservation, as I describe that as the move that we've come out of, has always been traditionally played out in the countryside. Farming support, rare species, important habitats. But the work also has to be delivered in those places where people live. I read a statistic from inner city Birmingham about access to green space, and it's completely reflected in the longevity and the life expectancy of people. So this is, again, going back to the point about this is the infrastructure for people's health, the economy, etc. And we believe very strongly that much of our work has to concentrate through our Connecting People with Nature program in these urban areas, and largely working with other partners who are already equipped to do this kind of work. But we have some initiatives, like we have a Nature for Everyone fund, which funded 100 projects looking to do things like tree planting, improving pathways, pond creation, that kind of thing, near where people live. It also plays out to the government's ambition to have green in 15. People access high quality green space within 15 minutes. Think of the benefit that would have over a multi-decade period on the bill for the NHS if people were using that space regularly and didn't find it something alien to them, or it wasn't safe, or it wasn't something that they understood. We do some urban greening pilots with local authorities, just getting more quality green space into urban developments and getting people access to them. And of course, I should give a shout out to work we're doing with the Trust and the National Lottery on the nature in towns and cities. Again, a big program of work designed around that agenda, which is where people live, getting nature easily accessible to them and getting the benefits of it.
I'll just build on that. We're doing a major conference on Monday in partnership with the Wellcome Trust on the relationship between public health and the climate emergency. And Wellcome has done a huge investment in this obvious nexus. But one of the panels is on heat. And I was absolutely stupefied by the data on this, that twofold. One, the excess infant and elderly mortality that is now happening in cities as a result of extreme heat is terrifying. And the correlation between rises in heat in urban centers and crime and violence is also a one-to-one correlation. So you think about building out green spaces and bringing nature into cities. It's not just having some lovely trees. It has massive information on literally life and death and on the way we conduct ourselves and violence and crime. So, Julie, Carl.
Sorry, just a very quick one, because I have mentioned our site, and I don't want to leave people with the impression that the hard-nosed financial sacrifices a societal element, because it doesn't. And actually, the tangible example that I gave, the site is near Gatwick, and actually the sites that we're looking at and thinking about for our own projects, we want them to echo Aidan's kind of exact philosophy, to be near urban centres, because we want people to have access to them. So this isn't a closed off site in the middle of nowhere where we're growing non-indigenous trees. This is something done in a sympathetic way, which has a societal impact because it will allow local populations to go there. So we're thinking about the boardwalks, we're thinking about the signs you get which tell you what type of wildlife is around, and so on and so forth, because we think that is our role to play. And I'm happy sacrificing a little bit of yield for the fact that you have a societal impact in these areas, because I think that is key, to Aidan's point, to generating this longevity and this passion for nature. I mean, I grew up in South Africa for a few years, right? And that's where my personal passion came from. And it's, if you don't have access to nature, you seeing it on TV is not the same. And there's lots of mental health benefits to do with nature as well. So I see this as a kind of a needed element to the nature restoration.
Julie and then Aidan.
I think one of the important things is this has to be a question that companies and the partners that you're working with need to be thinking about, right? When we do an RFP to find projects, one of the key questions is, how is the local community engaged and going to benefit from this work? And you have to, I mean, it sounds really basic, but you have to put that question in. You have to really press on it to understand what is truly happening. And that, to us, is what helps determine what really is a good project. It's not just about the biodiversity benefits. It's not just about the trees. It's about how people are included in that. And I think just one component on the urban side of things, Salesforce helped fund with American Forest First and then Woodland Trust in the UK, something called the Tree Equity Score, which is an online tool open to all to help identify where do we have gaps in tree cover, where are trees needed most in urban environments, which can then be used as a tool for those planting on the ground, local policymakers, to identify the right places so that we are making this equitable.
Aidan.
Just wanted to add the point, going back to my point about the population and where it lives. If we want people to value nature, enjoy it and benefit from it, and in the longer term, make pro-nature choices, you've got to expose them to it where they live. And that kind of completes the circle. It's not something they just see on the TV, it's something you benefit from in their daily life. And that's something they will demand through their voting patterns, etc., going forward. The more green space we get, the more access people have to it, the more society starts to value nature and reach those millions we talked about at the start of the meeting.
So now I want to come a little bit to the question of both external communication and internal advocacy. So part of the reason we're having this panel is, trying to think about what role business can play in mobilizing, protecting, extracting value from in business terms, but doing so in a high integrity way in relation to nature. And I think it's fair to say that in the climate movement, broadly put, we've become rather good at sort of going, how do we get to net zero by 2050, and then measuring it in terms of gigawatts and taking the different sectors and thinking about how you're going to do offshore wind's share of that and how you're going to do smart grids and long-term renewable batteries, and getting very technical very quickly and completely failing on the communication challenge. And then I'll say kind of demagogues on the other side who want to kind of say that the climate crisis is all a bunch of sort of greeny propaganda are quite good at comms, and it's unsurprising that perhaps they're winning. And so one of the things I'd like to ask you a little bit about is, how do you frame this in ways that are inspiring to millions of people, to young people, so that it feels real and tangible and sellable? Because as business people, that's of value to you, but it's also a high integrity reason to do it. And then secondly, what challenges or reflections would you have in making the case internally, so that you're not sort of accused of sort of being at the, you know, the green vanguard within your own business, and people go, oh, there they come again, and this is, you know, silly and nice to have and greenwashing, and but really, do we really need that, and how's that going to impact EBITDA? So those two questions, framing it externally but also doing the internal comms to kind of build a consensus amongst your colleagues. Come on, Judy.
Such a good question. I feel like my whole job is just reframing and framing again and reframing to someone else the same thing in a slightly different way. But I think what that underscores is everyone can connect to nature. Their way of connecting to it might just differ. So I think what has worked really well for us externally is being really clear, really tight with our language, and illustrating what we're doing with public examples, providing transparency on what our 100 million tree commitment looks like. You can deep dive on the projects that we've supported, clicking through a map, right? Internally, to get folks motivated in the first place, I think that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. But really leaning into the opportunities, I think, has been super helpful for us. You can talk about risk management all day long, and we have loads of stats to help demonstrate to the business why investing in nature is a smart move for Salesforce. Certain folks really get that. Other people don't care at all, right? They've got other business priorities that they need to manage and monitor, and the nature risks are a second priority for them. And I think for those stakeholders, and if we think about, you know, Salesforce being a software company, working with some of the largest enterprises in the world, the language that they know and understand is software. And communicating with them the opportunities to accelerate our customers, putting tools in the hands of our customers, that's something they know really, really well. And that's why it was a really important part of our strategy, right? To have that pillar around accelerating our customers, because that's Salesforce's bread and butter. We've taken that, and I think in terms of communication, right, all of our sales teams, all of our engineers are working day in and day out with our customers, so also know our customers' challenges really well. What we're now on a journey to do is, you know, how can we showcase that nature is really on the rise for companies, that this is a really growing issue that solutions need to be developed for, and creating those solutions is something that's going to happen in tandem with our customers, but also with other partners in the ecosystem. So for example, Salesforce launched the Nature Tech Alliance now probably 2 years ago with partners at Planet Labs, Nature Metrics, and ERM, the consulting firm, because each of those organizations has something really unique to bring to these conversations. And by leveraging those kind of superpowers of each organization, we can come in and help better tackle a customer's challenge, right? Whether that's biodiversity management and monitoring, whether that's the risk management side of things, whether that's supply chain management and traceability. Having those folks working together is really powerful. And then the other exciting thing that we've done recently is obviously AI is something we are hyper focused on right now, and what can agents do to help our customers. But we're seeing a lot of organizations not really know how to navigate that. They might have ideas, but they don't necessarily have the technical capabilities. So we've started an AI accelerator for NGO customers of ours to participate in to help fund solutions that they want to build, give them pro bono support, give them Salesforce tools and technology to bring some of those ideas to life. So one that's happening is the World Economic Forum is building a tree agent with the hopes that that can better connect different organizations doing restoration in particular locations and do some of that matchmaking. So a couple of exciting things, but the key takeaway is meet people where they're at, right? You need to communicate what is in it for them. And for us, that's really been leaning into the software side of things.
A tiny plug for Salesforce on this. I had a conversation with one of your colleagues yesterday. I think you had some insane number, like over 100 use cases of agentic AI for climate benefits, and we're combing through those, and this is just one of them. So if you want AI to save the day, come and speak to Julie.
Yeah, come talk to me afterwards. I'd love to hear more ideas.
Good. Carl, tell us about your response to that, to my original question.
So it's a great question, and one I think is applicable to every business, regardless what you do. And I'm going to meander a little bit, but not too long, so cut me off when I do. I think the first thing I want to say before I articulate, I guess, how we think about it is it's that the communication challenge is tangible and it's there. But we also, on the other side, need to reflect on a couple of pieces, or I have done certainly in this, insofar as if you look at a lot of the underlying stats, we shouldn't get too disheartened insofar as the majority of people, certainly in the UK, if not globally, think nature and climate degradation is real and it's an important topic. That the fact that the media has become more polarized because that's what sells the stories is something we should also reflect on, in that it's not necessarily the view, whilst it's grating for us, that isn't the groundswell of opinion. And we should also reflect that we are sometimes fighting a battle knowing that what we're doing is right in the long term, but also sometimes forgetting people's short-term issues are the things that are pressing and the thing they mostly care about. And when that's cost of living and so on, knowing that what's happening, whilst accepted, sometimes is going to be very difficult to win that battle when there are those short-term facts. So I think, again, the point I guess I'm making is we shouldn't just jump to a negative conclusion. There's a lot of dynamics in here we need to think about. And from a business perspective, you have sometimes that slightly more long-term approach. And that, for me, is what underpins the comms. And I mentioned it in one of my previous answers because I've only been in role 18 months, so it's not long. So I've had time to undertake a strategic review and get a little bit of a handle on what this market is like. And the thing that I found that a lot of companies had gone on the climate transition path, but had done it because it was the right thing to do, not necessarily thinking about why they were doing it for their businesses. And actually linking that strategy, what's the strategic imperative for the business that you're working in to do this, is the thing that resonates the most. So I articulated ours as long-term value and risk management and so on, linking to that strategy so it becomes, to Julia's point, what's the opportunity here, not what's the risk management or what's the cost involved, because after a few years, those conversations just don't get airtime because, to your kind of green analogy, it's, oh no, here comes another cost discussion, as opposed to, why are we doing this? This is going to drive profit. This is going to protect the bottom line. Being able to articulate what that means for your business in a way that resonates and you can articulate externally, for me, is the most important thing in this at the moment. And then, money talks at the end of the day. The fact that you want to scale this, if you start to show increasing profit, some of those arguments about, that we face are asset managers, these funds aren't doing great, these are blah, blah, blah. You're able to go, no, we made this investment because it was the best one and it's yielding more than X, Y, Z. And the more that happens, the more all those arguments tend to go away. And for me, that's how you get the longevity in this. And nature was the natural extension to climate in that they're very intertwined, right? You can make the same arguments. And when I talked about the invest, operate, engage pillars right at the start, those were our climate change ones. We just integrated nature I won't say seamlessly because we might get into data and stuff next, but we integrated it into it, so it became an extension rather than a separate topic.
Lucinda?
Yeah, sure. So I totally agree with Julie that you've got to tune your message to your audience on this one. And I think we've got 3 core reasons why we are really dialing up our work on nature right now. The first one is because it resonates with customers. It resonates with customers far more than climate right now. And so Farm to Food Hall, I don't know if you've seen those adverts with Tom Kerridge. That's our most successful campaign by a significant margin. And that Tom Kerridge out on farm talking not about the product, but also as well about the nature and how it's farmed and how what we've done and the sustainable farming that goes behind it. And that I think is really key and helps get that cut through to customers. It's also a key part, sustainability is a key part of quality in the minds of our customers. So I think it's why we sell wild farmed bread, for example, at £4 a loaf, because customers really understand that this is really great quality food. And that's sort of the external messaging. Then internally and with our farmers, I think it's much more about, look, this is about long-term ability to farm sustainably and to protect ourselves against the shocks. The short-term shocks that might be a flood and the long-term shocks that might be the climate, what it's doing to the soil, etc. And I mean, again, the farming program I've talked about, but I think we will move in our next 5 years to much more outcome-based metrics. But anecdotally, farms, we went to a farm the other day in Norfolk and they said, well, it was after all the flooding and the very, very, very wet winter last year. And they said, look, our ground, we're actually all right here because we've done loads of cover crops. But if you drive up through, Norfolk, you'll see that there's loads of standing water. We don't have any of that because we've got cover crops. Oh, great. Okay. So I think a lot of the principles really begin then to manifest themselves in our ability. If our farmers can't grow it, we can't sell it. And so that's working together is super important. And I think a lot of the nature-based solutions that we have been promoting and working with our farmers on is helping build that long-term resilience. And then thirdly, the point around external reporting. I mean, there's luckily a very small and niche audience that we need to talk about that with internally, but it is another reason to do it and start to measure it. I think quite hard for a retailer to measure nature in every aspect because we touch it, particularly a food retailer, nature is basically our business, but in terms of growing things, but I think, that is a growing reason to do work in this area.
Something we shall return to. Aidan, your thoughts?
I was just going to say that I don't have the challenge of having to reframe stuff internally in Natural England very often because we're generally on the same page. But our new strategy clearly focuses on, I think, an expanded role for working with the business sector. We see the reach through the supply chain and customer base as the place where we can inspire millions and connect millions of people to the plight of nature and the need to recover it. We're very keen that businesses make nature a very visible part of their brand, their footprint and their purpose, and move it, I hope, from the kind of CSR envelope into the core identity of the businesses. It helps the bottom line, as Carl was saying. It becomes part of the business rationale, and therefore, businesses have a clear way in to get involved in this at a much bigger scale than they currently are.
Okay, I'm going to try and ask a sort of a kind of wrap-up question, and I'm going to beg all of you to make your answers interesting, because my question is going to be related to data and measurement and standards. And every time you ask this question, people's eyes glaze over. We go into acronym soup, and it becomes terrible. So what I'd like to do is ask you about the importance of measurement systems that get applied, and then how they help both guide your business, deal with risk, how they can create bear traps, because when you start measuring stuff, you can start either greenwashing or not, and you get caught out in PR when you start doing it. But tell us a little bit about measurements and how you've thought about it. And I know that you've been you've been grappling with it. So I'm going to start with you, Judy.
Certainly. We've done a TNFD pilot. We did a full TNFD assessment.
What's
Task
TNFD?
Force for nature-related financial disclosures. The LEAP assessment, locate, evaluate, assess, and prioritize. Prepare, thank you so much. Acronym soup. I won't go into the details of that. Those assessments have been very helpful to us as a business because, to my point around you have to take different stakeholders with you, certain stakeholders within our business really respond well to that kind of information, those formulaic steps, the fact that it's an external standard body, maybe they don't describe a standard body, but external body and guidance that is kind of validated, right? And that works really well for some stakeholders in the business. So I think my point around data and measurement is that for us, it's been a really important tool to bring people along on this journey, right? By using the LEAP assessment and that process to look at our value chain, look at our direct operations, that's how our relationship around nature and water really began with our infrastructure team, getting them in as a key stakeholder, giving them some ownership over this information, ensuring that they felt that they were playing a really helpful role in this process, and also building their familiarity with some of these terms and complex concepts, right? So I think for us, it's a mechanism to help move the business along, and I think it really does play that accountability role, right? There's an expectation that we will redo these assessments again in the future. And in the interim, people are asking questions around what's been done to date. What are the outcomes of having done that? So I think it's for us, it has been a very helpful conversation starter. It has not been the be all end all of how we landed on our nature strategy by any means. For that, we really leaned into the expertise of the business, but we did use that as a conversation starter with a lot of our folks internally, and it's been also a great tool for connecting with other companies, learning best practices. I think it's a conversation starter.
Carl?
So I'm not going to make this very interesting, but the thing that really resonates with me is, why are you measuring it and what are you going to do with it? Right, we're awash, regardless what acronyms that you want to use, regardless of what reporting regimes we're all under. Why are we doing it? So as an ex-CFO, the amount of time we spend reporting on the past is phenomenal. Like, it's so much work, and climate and nature is the same. And a lot of the information, sometimes you scratch your head, even knowing that I care about the topic, who's going to look at this? And actually, for me, it is very much that we are doing the same, right? We were an early adopter of TNFD, and we're going through that process, but we're still challenging ourselves on, well, what the hell are we going to do with it, and why is it material? And how do we communicate that, to your point? The greenwashing is there, but a bit like climate, you just disclose very clearly what risks there are in the data and so on. For me, it's the journey, right? It's water usage, it's deforestation, it's the stat that you then say to yourself, well, I want to set a target on this, or there's another lens, which is, I am going to explore and understand this company's risks in more detail arising from nature, which is another lens which you need that data for. But again, it's what are you asking for and where you're trying to get to. That, for me, is the power of the reporting, that we need to get over this hump of constant report, and move to the, what the hell are we all doing about it, rather than just reporting it.
Lucinda, you obviously have a business that's customer facing. Also, you do your own internal audits. So tell us a little bit about this measurement question for yourself, how much customers care and how much you use it as a tool yourselves.
Okay, so I guess just thinking about it as others were talking, I do think that what I'm terrified of is that we end up chasing nature metrics for the sake of nature metrics, not really knowing, exactly to your point, why we're doing it, because I think that is just, in a team that, we're all short of time and we're always very busy, that seems pointless. So I think we've got two reasons to measure nature, if you like, and this probably, one, I think, so for example, I take something like AgriSound. If I have a long 2 or 3 year partnership now with AgriSound, who are a little box, I'm going to describe this really badly, but they are a little box that you can put on your tree or whatever in an orchard, and it will measure wing beats that it hears of pollinators, and it will tell you whether you've had a billion, I think we had a day at G's last year which had 1 billion wing beats in a day, and you think that's amazing. Well, I don't know if that's amazing or not. It may just be normal. It may be a bad year for pollinators. I've got no idea. But so you've got to measure these things over the long term, and they've got to be genuinely useful for farmers, because what's the point in understanding how many pollinators you have if they are not enough for what you need them to do or whatever. So I think there's an element of it. We've got a long way to go with nature metrics to make them useful, but they potentially can be very useful to drive yield, to drive best practice, etc. So I think, one, they've got to be useful. Otherwise, I think it's very hard to justify spending time on them. And two, I think they've got to, for us, I think, if I'm honest, we've probably come at nature metrics slightly through the carbon lens, because I look at all of the work that we're doing on, if I look at our challenge of carbon, the vast majority of certainly our flag emissions sits in obviously our agricultural value chain. And I know that so many of the projects that we are doing have massive carbon benefit, but they're really hard to measure. I mean, we've looked at different ways of doing it, but we need really hard metrics then to feed through, to be auditable in the long term, to feed through to say we've reduced our carbon footprint by this much. And I think measuring nature and bringing the carbon angle into that is going to be really critical for us. So I don't think I've answered your question at all, but those would be the two areas that, as I was thinking about, as everyone else was saying, I think those would be the two areas that where nature metrics could bring value. But as I say, what I'm slightly worried about is we just end up chasing nature metrics for the sake of it, and they don't actually drive any change or in
People will remember pollinator wing beats long after this talk is over, I can assure you. So very, very helpful in my mind. Aidan.
I was just thinking about the experience of my organization coming through, I think, a transformation from a nature conservation sector to a nature recovery sector. The conservation sector is awash with data historically, fledgling productivity, population trends, but really what we've been doing is evidencing the slow inexorable decline of nature and our ecosystem services. We're now at a stage where, as somebody said earlier, nature is having its moment and business is aware of this and really wants to get involved. So what we have to do is move into a position where we can provide the certainty through data for businesses to make business decisions and invest. And that's very cold, calculating and pragmatic, and quite far removed from my starting point in nature conservation, which is, I would say, use a word that the trusts are a big fan of, and some I genuinely love nature. But what we're talking about here is recovering the life support systems as a country and working with business to do that. For that to be successful, businesses tell me they need certainty, and they need consistency, and they need confidence, and they need high integrity markets. Everything around data needs to drive and support those. So there is a consistent approach around the country. People can dip in, they know what they're getting, and the sector understands that it needs to provide this information so businesses can make those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I mean, I think an incredibly thoughtful, insightful conversation from practitioners who have got their teeth into it from a whole bunch of different sectors, finance, consumer, technology, from a kind of regulator perspective and, as well. It's now for me to turn it over to the audience, because there's an exceptional group of experts in the room as well, and to pepper you with questions. So there's a hand already. And another.
Hello. Thank you, guys. Very interesting. Paul, you said at the beginning nature is having a moment. And I wonder, in what sense is it having a moment? Because I've founded a startup which helps individuals and companies protect nature. And, we have a rainforest protection project in the Solomon Islands. You mentioned measuring. We're actually using AgriSound's microphones. Cambridge did the carbon analysis. Revenue share with communities is better than anyone else in our industry by a factor of 3. And yet when we get in the room with large corporates, they say to us, there's no budget, or budgets are tight, which I felt like saying, I'll show you a tight budget. You haven't seen one in 30 years, mate. But my question is, how much is it having a moment in terms of airtime and reporting? And how much is it having a moment? And clearly there are some exceptions on this panel, but how much is it having a moment in terms of money actually flowing?
Money actually flowing, that must be you.
So it's a good passover for your nature is a moment comment. I agree with you, by the way. So my take on it is it's having a moment in that it's starting to accelerate like the climate discussion had, but in terms of monetary flows, it's nowhere near as large as it needs to be. And Aidan has touched upon some of the drivers of what we need on that. I think as a large-scale investor, and I'm talking now hundreds of millions, if not billions, into this, just from an LNG perspective, right? This is the scale, which is how do nature projects and businesses become attractive for us and others to invest in? And one of the big challenges I've found is what is the income and what is the demand that's being generated from the nature project, right? We all know it's doing the right thing, but there has to be something at the end that repays the investor back and gives them a profit compared to something else. And actually, an example or some of where it's been really difficult is I've used debt for nature swaps. That's fantastic. But actually on pure nature restoration, some of those returns aren't there because it tends to be an impact type investment or philanthropic, which is not scalable. And therefore, one of the largest barriers and also one of the biggest opportunities in this field is creation of an income through something which is relating to nature. Aidan mentioned biodiversity net gain in the UK. From my perspective, that is a fantastic start in being able to create the environment where there's a credit which is tradable, costs money, and is required by someone, and someone in this case, land developers. That, in my opinion, is something I'm talking about with others, DEFRA included, on how do you scale that globally? That type of idea, ultimately somebody has to pay. And that's been the big issue in nature, is that its degradation and its destruction has been to create profit by doing something else. We now need to either force those people to pay or find some way of creating the fact that there's an environment that then is able to be invested in because there's a demand created on a need, which is a biodiversity credit or so on. So the long-winded way of saying, I agree with you, but it's getting airtime because it's catching up, and people, I think someone on the panel measured it resonating as well very deeply, and you don't have that necessary kind of climate shift and difference in the political opinions with nature at the moment. But hopefully that's helpful.
I'm going to, if I may, partly because we're doing a project with the National Trust and with the Crown Estate on this topic, sort of jump on that, if I may, which is, I think one of the challenges is you can have an idea, but unless you have a market and unless you have a regulated way, a certain way that things can be paid for, it's going to stay an idea for a very long time. And so one of the ways that we've tried to get to this is think about nature via flooding. So we're launching a project to do a £1 billion flood bond to build out wetlands across the UK as a form of green infrastructure. And guess what? It's not going to be funded by biodiversity net gain or carbon credits or water quality. It's going to be funded by people who are interested in paying for the avoidance of flood risk. Because flood risk is, to your point, the real damage, right? And so often when we talk about externalities, those externalities, we kind of think about them. Soil gets eroded, so it becomes less productive. And then it goes, well, got to get regen farming to help that back, but you could go through a valley of death of productivity to get through it, and then you need interesting financing mechanisms, and then you've got to think about how the money stacks up. On flooding, it's pretty clear, right? We've got huge damage, and the government has just announced a major project to deal with flooding. So there's actually payors, both in the form of water companies, the government, and downstream asset holders. So you can fund that infrastructure and then create the climate co-benefits alongside it, but not rely on them, and then build up the climate co-benefit markets as a second instance. And I guess one of the things for all of us is, how mature are our climate co-benefit markets as of right now, and how bankable are they, and what do we need to do to augment them so that they become bankable in the way that other markets do? Because you need certainty, you need standardization, you need aggregation, and you need scale to make markets. And those things they're upon us. And I think BNG the example of what it could become, but we're not quite there yet. But I think the has a moment thing means that everybody in this room and hopefully many more people beyond it are going to start innovating to start making those markets, and then it will go from a discussion to a reality. Over there, and then I've got
Thanks. Oh, it's actually a continuation of your point, so that's handy. Just following on from that, totally agree. I mean, we've had conversations about this as well. I wanted to ask Aidan about that exact thing. So natural flood management, totally agree, think it's the cornerstone for where the product and investment can come from. But are you doing any thinking about regulating that market? We need to bring cross-sector stakeholders together, and we're doing this at the minute, but it's all under wraps. Like, we need a bit more standardization there. So are you doing any thinking in that space?
That's largely driven by work from the Environment Agency, as you probably know. And one of the things we're trying to do is make sure that natural flood management is an active part of the business conversation there, rather than the lion's share of the flood defence budget going through the traditional means, which is, flood concrete defences and that. And so we're working hard for them to kind of understand that, delivering something with softer remedies, which incorporate nature-based solutions, as it were, can create multiple benefits in delivering nature targets, etc., rather than just it's the flood defence. So the key point I'm trying to make here is that we need to look for opportunities when public money is being spent in large quantities to get multiple benefits from it. So that's the conversation we're in with our colleagues in the EA.
I keep trying to give you the mic, but it will come, I promise.
Hello, my name's Sarah, and I work in the data center industry, which is relatively immature when it comes to sustainability and nature. So we're at the very beginning of our journey in terms of how do we also kind of build nature and nature-based solutions into our operations. For a business smaller than obviously Salesforce, for example, what would you recommend are the things we consider as we begin our journey, kind of thinking about how we build nature into the way that we operate and how we support communities?
Great question. There is a phenomenal working group out of Tech UK, which I'm not sure if you're part of, but focused on nature and data centers, particularly in the UK. And I've found that to be a really great community. Salesforce leases our data centers and or uses public cloud providers. So it really becomes a supply chain question for us. I think one of the things I run into as we engage our value chain is there's a real lack of data out there, a real lack of measurement. So that feels something like pretty low-hanging fruit for a data center operator, in my view. Maybe there's other challenges you're running up against, but that feels like some low-hanging fruit that it would be very helpful for larger companies that are your customers, who will inevitably begin asking more detailed questions around nature and water to kind of get a handle on from the beginning. But then I think there's plenty of other really interesting opportunities. We were just talking about heat exporting. We were talking about on-site opportunities. I think some of the pieces around flood management are interesting as well, right? How can you integrate nature from the ground up in your designs? Because, as we know, once a data center is constructed, it's there and becomes legacy infrastructure quite quickly. So I think there's I think that Tech UK group, you'd find some great peers to be surrounded by. And I think design considerations from the start and data availability in terms of how you're operating are both really, really helpful. And the way we're thinking about approaching it with our providers is this is going to be an ongoing conversation with our providers then of how can we also think about co-investing in some of those areas that we're operating in to support nature-based solutions that are in that area that would benefit that community. So I think consider too how you might be engaging your customers to co-fund some of these things.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. I mean, your examples are inspiring and the leadership you're showing is great. But we live in incredibly challenging times, and you've touched on this a little bit. And I'm worried that there's a significant percentage of our population, and certainly the US population, who want you and many to fail at this because they can make example. So I'm interested in sort of thoughts on that, because we need this example to convince so many other businesses, some in the room, to actually go as far as you have?
Happy to start. This is a very interesting time that we find ourselves in, and I think a question we get time and time again is, how are you, exactly your question, Stuart. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is maybe, in the public domain, companies are being a bit more quiet around what they're doing, right? And I think that kind of relates to the earlier question of why are we not seeing funding opening up from companies for nature projects? And I think part of that is companies are nervous. We talk to a lot of peers that are really risk averse, and it makes sense when the new headlines are taking down companies for having made an investment that went south. Yeah, I get that. Our media should absolutely be scrutinizing these investments in these projects, but we should be scrutinizing them with the end goal of what do we change in the future to make sure that it is a success. And I think right now, the business working groups that we are part of are more active than ever, of companies sharing with one another how they're navigating these political challenges, how they're building confidence with their leadership to get more money into the right projects, really tactical conversations. So I think we're doubling down on those groups that we're already part of, because those communities are really helpful for kind of moving as, bringing others along, power in numbers. So I think a lot of that is happening now, unfortunately, in closed door meetings, but I think we will see the results of that in due time. But that's why it's increasingly important that we do get stakeholder pressure from our investors, from our customers that are asking us to do more, because that really drives us to take action.
Carl?
It's a great question, and a very difficult one to navigate. No, that's okay. Just thinking about making sure I don't create the headlines we talked about before. So the way we're looking at it, and then there might be a talk about personally as well, is that it's a re-articulation rather than a change. It's a re-articulation of why we're doing this. And I mentioned before, sorry if I repeat myself, long-term value creation for our customers and clients and shareholders. Financially material and risk management, right? That's all our fiduciary duty. That's aligned with our strategy, and that holds today. It will hold tomorrow, and it held yesterday. Okay, that's why we're here. And actually, the way I articulated LNG right at the start is we're an asset manager on other people's behalves, and an asset owner, and we invest on our behalf. And they all create value in different ways, but the point being is that we're not seeing a reduction in client demand for these types of strategies. Okay, that's point number one, right? There might be a lot of, bluster's the wrong word, I can't think of a better word, but noise around this, but we're not seeing that impact us. And actually our duty is to offer a range of funds for a range of different appetites, and that includes the basic index tracking, it includes ESG tilted, it includes more specific clean energy funds, so on and so. The key thing is someone wants to invest in it, and we can demonstrate it creates value. And our firm belief, and mine, is that it will create value over the long term, and we just need to recognize that for most views that are anti-climate, or there's an agenda behind them, just as there is on every view that someone holds. You just need to be aware of it. And actually, that I didn't quote the stat, but the point I wanted to make about the media really was that you hear this because it's a polarized view and it's headline grabbing. Actually, the majority of people don't think that. So that's one thing to hold on to, is it's not the majority. It just gets a huge amount of airtime, and unfortunately, it will put us back years. But fundamentally, the long-term trends are there. It's the right thing to do. And look, I mean, I'll mention clean energy as a last statement, that regardless of the climate, it's likely the world will be moving to clean energy anyway, because it's a more cheap, efficient form of energy. Creates UK green jobs or green jobs. It's climate just tends to be the driver and the thing that's used as a linchpin, the world will just move in that direction and over time anyway. So, you know, we can talk about net zero in different fora. That the reality is it was never going to be a smooth path. It still is the destination from my perspective. These are just the lumps in the road before we get there.
We've heard quite a lot about reporting and internal discussions and senior stakeholder management and aligning things to strategy, but I wanted to ask about how you're engaging maybe frontline staff and the people who are out having conversations with customers, whether that's in store or in a more business setting, and how are you really supporting and engaging your staff with your work around nature? Is it through volunteering, internal comms, and then also supporting their onward quality conversations with your customers as well? Thinking a bit back to that last point, you know, giving your teams the confidence to really be talking about your work in an authentic way.
So yeah, absolutely. So I think we have an ongoing program of communication to store colleagues, which we have a Plan A network, which is sort of every store has a Plan A network representative, and so we have talk. We have a series of lunch and learns. I think it's those sorts of things. And actually, the one thing that we have done recently is engage some Plan A ambassadors, who are Ben Fogel, and a new one to be disclosed, but I probably shouldn't say who it is because I might get in trouble. But I think so. Someone like Ben Fogel has really helped us, you know, get traction not only with customers but also with employees, and people see what he does. He goes into store and he talks. So I think for us it's an ongoing drumbeat, and I think people are very, very proud of the work that M&S has done over the years on this. So it's definitely something. Now, yes, do our store staff know every single ingredient that goes in to a loaf of bread and how it's sustainably sourced? Probably no, and that's work for me and my team to think about. But very often that's not often the question as well that customers are exactly asking in a store, because very often they've seen something and sustainability we find is the reason why customers cross the road to come to us, but when they're in store they're looking at price and they're not thinking about it. So it's a sort of slightly different narrative. I don't know, there aren't many customers who challenge us on and ask questions about sustainability in store. Although every time I am in store, which is quite a lot, we do 7 days a year and mainly at Christmas, which is manic. If I get an opportunity, I will tell people exactly where our honey comes from, because we've got some wonderful, or if the people, you know, do you realise you know about this? So I do take the opportunity, but they probably walk away quite quickly sometimes.
I can see you stalking people in the stores, telling them about the honey. I'm
Do you know
going
about
through
honey?
my mind right now. Aidan.
Slightly different context. It's not business, it's public sector. It's an arm's length body of DEFRA that I work for, Natural England. But it's really important, this internal communication, because we speak to a lot of landowners, developers, businesses, that kind of thing. We have to equip our staff to understand, I think, the evolution we're going through, which is from what I mentioned earlier, that nature conservation, protect what's left, to working with and through others on nature recovery, a much wider, more ambitious agenda than we historically have had. So that requires embedding those messages and understanding them so people can go out and take more risks, try and work at a bigger scale, be less picky in the way we regulate. If we're working with a trusted partner, for example, those kind of things have to be embedded in the thinking of the organisation so we can respond to the challenges we're facing at the moment. Thank you.
Salesforce loves engaging our employees. I think one of the things we hear often of why people chose Salesforce of other tech companies is they love the values, and sustainability is one of our values. I think our tree program is the thing that folks get most excited about, right? It's something that they can contribute to. It's something that there's a local organization that's working on forest ecosystems that they have either volunteered at before coming to Salesforce or volunteering with because we've done a project with them. There's a number of ways to get engaged, but I think it comes back to Salesforce's core DNA. The company was founded with this 1-1-1 model, giving back 1% of time, equity, and product. And as part of that, our employees get 56 hours of volunteer time a year. And so we're trying to work with them to up-level some of the great partners we've been working with, give them those opportunities to volunteer on the ground. And I think that builds the engagement and buy-in to the commitments that we have. And then, of course, we're using our tools like Slack, as well as our platform, our learning platform Trailhead, which has courses on what does climate change mean in the business context? Is it important that companies are investing in forest ecosystems, which can give them that kind of baseline understanding that they can then take to some of those customer conversations.
Carl?
So last but not least, we re-articulated our purpose, I think, earlier this year, and I want to just give it to you because it resonates internally for exactly the same reason you just mentioned, and it's 10 words. It's investing for the long term. Our futures depend on it. Okay, so that encapsulates everything we're trying to do. It's clearly not just climate and nature, there's a whole societal element to that, but it's that long-term stewardship view. That's part of the reason why we've been around for so long and will continue to be, and why people want to work for Legal in General. It's that ethos, it's that purpose. That gets the buy-in. And then to the previous gentleman's question, it's, you're offering, it's not your hard selling, it's you're offering a range of different options to your customers. And it's that's the important element. And some people, like myself, I am happy if I need to take more risk to sacrifice more yield, if that's the outcome, and I don't believe it will be, but if it is, to not invest in X, Y, Z. And lots of people share that view, and over time, my fundamental belief is that long-term investment, because with pensions, and that's what it is, it's a long-term, will resonate with others, and it continues to do so with our customers as well.
I wonder whether, just in closing, the nature as an asset class, nature as a business case argument is also deeply buttressed by the fact that the ways in which the degradation of nature causes actual impact on people's lives are salient in ways that are not susceptible to politicization. So when you've been flooded, it's very difficult for somebody to say, well, no, you haven't been flooded, right? But it is difficult, it's easier to make an argument about, has man-made impact on nature, and will we get to 2 degrees by X date, etc. When the air quality is bad, when soil yields are degrading, when you have too little water or too much water, these physical constraints are, I think, giving us a really practical, non-ideological, citizen-based way of saying we ought to respond. And that basis then allows us to innovate and do all the things for the long term that you're all doing so capably and thoughtfully. But I also think it's sort of grounded in the real world. Like we've run out of rope on nature, and it's biting us, and that bite is causing us as humans to innovate, often too little and often too late, and we should have done it earlier, but now we are, and that urgency gives us political air cover, moral urgency, and innovation. And all of those things are what business ought to be doing at this particular moment. So thank you for an incredibly useful conversation for all of you. Thank you for your wonderful conversations. And one of the goals of the Conduit is that we make meaningful connections. So don't disperse, meet people you haven't met before, network, help each other out, hang out, and thanks so much for coming.